So this is an interview with Carolyn Campbell, and I think I'd like to begin by asking you, Carolyn, to what do you contribute the success of the Alliance and the success in protecting the Sonoran Desert? I think a lot of people contrast the success of this plan with the inability of the city of Tucson to do similar sorts of things so effectively. Maybe you don't want to make that comparison, but clearly the county has been successful. To what do you attribute this success?
I don't know. I wouldn't agree as far as Tucson in terms of the work we've been able to accomplish collectively in protecting habitat in Pima County in the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, mainly because the large blocks of habitat that still exist and are not developed or otherwise fragmented. For the most part, at least when we started this effort in 1997-98, were in unincorporated Pima County, as opposed to the developed areas of the city of Tucson, which, obviously it's an urban area, and other than some riparian corridors, as far as the coalition is concerned, and I think the biologists that put together this plan, there's limited opportunities left in at least let me say that with a caveat, at the time that the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan was launched.
Okay.
And I say that because since this effort began, both the town of Marana and the city of Tucson have annexed some large swaths of very important habitat for a couple of endangered species in particular. The Ironwood Forest area up in Marana, I think it was 40 square miles of what was considered at the time, because this pygmy owl is listed, critical habitat for the Cactus ferruginous pygmy owl, and the city of Tucson on the southeast side, and don't quote me on the numbers, but something like 26 square miles of important habitat for Pima pineapple cactus. But other than that, like I said, when we started, the real opportunities for putting together a preserve system that could protect the indigenous plants and animals for the long term really was unincorporated Pima County on the edges of the urban areas, including the large ranch lands.
Okay.
But let me just to specifically say what I think brought to the success. I think it was a variety of things. I think it was the timing. There was the political timing in the Board of Supervisors. There was some leadership from the federal government with the Interior Secretary at the time that was from Arizona, a particular interest in getting personally involved in seeing a multi-species habitat conservation plan in Pima County, which really, as far as I know, is still the largest acreage-wise habitat conservation plan that's ever been proposed with the federal government. And I would take a credit, too, from the coalition of environmental groups that got together, realizing this was an Endangered Species Act issue, and that for the most part around the country, when these processes are proposed, they're really very little input from the environmental community. Even though it's an environmental issue, it's usually government agencies and the regulated community. So, we got involved from the very beginning, and I think that's really helped shape the success of this.
All right. Can I follow up with that just a little bit? We're very interested in this coalition and how it was put together, most particularly the long-term personal relationships. It's interesting that in talking to people like Bill Shaw and Gail Hartman and Tom Sheridan, they've all known each other for years and worked in parallel on a number of things. Is that a part of your coalition, or do you see something else as part of the glue that holds this group together? And would you talk a little bit about your coalition?
Just, briefly how we formed, and then moving on to and I think there's a lot to be said for the broader alliances that got together and cooperated on this, not just our coalition.
Okay.
But in terms of our coalition in 1997, when the pygmy owl got listed, we were all, and to back up, there's been a fairly cohesive, or at least communicating group of environmental nonprofits here in Tucson for a long time. It's, you could say a hotbed of activism in various, social and environmental justice and environmental. But for environmental, and particularly, there are strong groups that have, national groups that have their regional headquarters here, such as Defenders of Wildlife and the Center for Biological Diversity, in particular, who had been following these processes, the multi-species or all habitat conservation plans around the country. So when the pygmy owl got listed, and those two groups were instrumental, they were the petitioners to get that little bird on the endangered species list, we got visits from other parts of the country from these groups to kind of guide us through this, saying, we all got involved too little, too late, and kind of, came limping up at the finish line, because the environmental communities aren't usually really pulled in, not to a large extent anyway, in these stakeholder groups. So there was some guidance that you need to get together and try to be a force so you can guide this and learn from some of both the mistakes and the lessons that we have learned. Defenders of Wildlife, for example, had just published a book called The Frayed Safety Net that talked about the issues, the lack of public participation, the lack of funding, on what were the shortcomings of these plans were. And so we took a lot of that to heart, and we decided that the way that we would do it was solicit whatever groups in the greater Tucson area wanted to be involved, and we would form a coalition, and actually not just a loose coalition, but a coalition that hired a staff to work on behalf of all these groups to and make sure that, I guess the bottom line is we saw the writing on the wall that the federal government was going to come in and say, this is the way you should do it, and it wasn't going to be anything that we could support.
Yes.
So in the meantime, and this I think is a key part of the steps that went through it, and it's funny, I was just talking with one of my now friends with the realtors last evening, and that was that the Board of Supervisors, who didn't know anything any more than I did about these kind of endangered species processes, their initial response was to strengthen the environmental ordinances like the WASH ordinance and the hillside development and the buffer zone, things that were already in place. And that just probably made the communities here more polarized than we already were. The development communities on one side and the neighborhood and environmental communities on the other side polarized over development. It was always a zero-sum game, and that's what happened over the next few months. We had public hearings that had to be moved to larger locations. We had there was some little violent. People were getting pushed and shoved and hit. There were some real tensions, and a few of us got together after getting a little bruised. There was meetings where we had to have there were metal detectors set up just for our public hearings on these environmental ordinances, and a few of us got together and said, "There's got to be another way." This is crazy. So a small time developer and a representative of the realtors and a couple of environmental folks, we just kind of went out and said, let's start looking at some positive solutions. So we in the meantime, the county was indeed talking to the federal government, the Interior Secretary, telling them this is what you have to put together, this broad countywide habitat conservation plan. And anyway, we started working together, and we were it was like you were talking about knowing people for a long time. We were building trust within just these few months that we started working together, and I in my part, people like Bill Shaw, and I knew Gail Hartman, but I hadn't worked with these people for years, but I had been working with the political leadership because I had been working for Molly McCass, and I'd been active in the Green Party and things like that. So I knew a lot of the political players, and I think that there was some trust there. But I was always convinced that we weren't going to get anything done if we just bullied our way into an elected board that was just recently became pretty green. You know, Raul Grijalva and Sharon Bronson and Ray Carroll. I mean, we just all of a sudden had kind of a majority on the board, but if we just bullied our way through, eventually the pendulum was going to swing back the other way. So then there was an 85-member steering committee, which was pretty contentious at times, but there was kind of a core group of people from different interest groups that just kept pushing forward and trying to look for solutions as opposed to just screaming louder and jumping up and down louder about property rights or ranching or, you know, whatever the issue might be, or, you know, on our part, you know, endangered species and how important this is, and we met for 4 years.
How did this core group get itself together? Did it self-select, or what was the process by which 85 people became this core group?
Well, first of all, the 85 people, you might already know this, but when the county made a call to put together a stakeholder committee, they decided, Maylene Deanne, which you've probably heard her name quite a few times. I don't know if you had a chance to meet her or not. But she recently passed away, but she was working for the county administrator, and she was pretty much in charge. She was the one that was delegated to be in charge of this. And she had decided that the best way to do this, instead of the county selecting, is that whoever expresses interest and writes a letter that they want to be on this committee will be on. So that's how the big group got started. And the smaller one, I mean, now that I'm, you know, speaking in kind of past history,
right? Because,
you know, it seemed like, you know, this small group got together pretty quickly, but it did take a while. I mean, it got together over the course of 4 years. It was almost 4 years. It was more than 3.5 years of meetings before we did self-select, and a lot of that was a mistrust in the entire group that wouldn't allow and wouldn't trust that any small subset would be able to formulate policies and bring them back to the group. I mean, we spent probably 1.5 years just talking about the rules of engagement in voting and, you know, consensus or supermajority or motions and all that. It was very frustrating. But in the meantime, you know, I think that the best way, think about it, is that we were observing each other over the course of these years where, you know, people were kind of ready to pull their hair out, and some people did either drop out or not show up very often because it was very frustrating. And, you know, after we met every month, so after, you know, meeting every month for a couple of years, you start to realize who the people are that are there to try to be productive. Mm-hmm. And so after, you know, after we'd been meeting for over 3 years, we started talking about putting together different proposals before the whole group, and at one point something broke and somebody suggested that maybe we had a subcommittee that took these different visions and these different proposals and tried to hammer something out. There was still, even when that happened, there were still some people that did not want to see that move forward. So, you know, there was some attacks on that little group, but we just plotted our way through it. I will, just for your information, it probably doesn't matter who they are, but there was myself. Yes. Gail Hartman was on there representing her group, Buffers, I think it was, or maybe, I can't remember, I think Buffers, and then, because we were all representing, most of us were representing constituency groups. The Tucson Association of Realtors, the Pima County Private Property Rights Association, the Nature Conservancy, Tucson Audubon, and there was someone from the Altar Valley, can't remember what it's called, Altar Valley Conservation Alliance, you know, the ranchers in Altar Valley that came to quite a few of the meetings as well. And we basically had a pact that we weren't there just to agree amongst each other. We had a pact that we were going to take whatever we did and go out and get agreement from the larger constituency groups. And since there was nobody there from the Home Builders Association particularly, then it fell to the one wildcat developer from the Property Rights Association and the realtors representative to go back and talk with that constituency and get some buy-in before we kind of, this part of it is kind of classic, I guess, but it did take it was a long, difficult road to get there.
Okay, don't intend to interrupt your narrative here, but I'm interested in the Center for Biological Diversity and the Defenders of Wildlife. You say they were really helpful in providing first the court case, which sort of was a turning point, and then advice to the group. Did they stay involved? You mentioned the Tucson, the Nature Conservancy, but of course it has an office here, so it's very much as well as local, the Audubon Society, and I guess they're all in some ways embedded in place, NGOs. What I'm getting at is sometimes people think that national groups come in, cause conflict, claim victories, and don't sort of live with the consequences. Have you got a comment on that?
Absolutely, and I should have said that the one group that I did not mention that was on that group, that smaller group, is the Center for Biological Diversity.
Okay.
And they are headquartered. Their national headquarters is in Tucson.
Yes.
But and just so you know, I don't know if you've been to our website or anything, but the center is they're one of our members, Audubon, those defenders, they're all Sierra Club, they're all members of the coalition. So in a sense, I'm working for all of them, and I was the person representing them at these meetings. But in the meantime, I think, I'll back up with the Center for Biological Diversity. I believe that a piece of what brought our strength to this process was this unstated and underlying fear, or whatever you want to call it, or understanding that the center would sue at the end of all this. That the center, we're trying to, and a lot of what we were trying to do with this was to avoid lawsuits.
Yes.
Because that's what keeps these things in conflict for years, sometimes decades. And so I believe that was that hammer that I think there was strength in the coalition, that we were keeping them, they were keeping us honest, but we were keeping them in check.
Yes.
Because we have very strict kind of consensus within the coalition, and our fights are all internal. But when we went out to the public, we were speaking with the united voice for 40 groups, and you can't knock that.
No, it's amazing.
But in terms of that, I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question.
No, you're doing it beautifully.
I believe, though, that I could not have been as successful in that small group of selling this vision that we came up together with the different stakeholders if the Center for Biological Diversity, even though I'm working for them, wasn't also physically sitting at the table and agreeing to these things. Because it would have been harder for me to go back and say, these are kind of some of the compromises we made. But seeing the center there, which doesn't always happen because they many times would rather be in court than to sit down with, not for court, but with the enemy,
Yes. No, it's actually other people have criticized the center just on these grounds.
But they were there, and they were a huge part of this because they came along with some of our biggest wins in terms of, I don't even want to go into the specifics, but say about property rights or whatever, that they were right along there, and they were, giving this up to get some larger habitat protection goals. And so far in this process, they have never filed suit. The home builders have sued over the pygmy owl or the different issues on this 3 or 4 times. And so I think that in this process, and it's not over yet, so they may sue someday, but we're working as a coalition and we're pushing whatever we can and keeping them, I hate to say in check, but I think it's been pretty successful on that account in particular. And it's funny that people still criticize the center when the center was an integral part of the leadership of the coalition.
Right.
And
they haven't criticized the center in relation to this particular plan.
Right.
It had more to do with things that have happened in the Upper Gulf. So I need to be clear about clear about that. Okay, I do, though, want to be sure that I understand what you're saying, because I am concerned about this relationship of process to people. You seem to put a lot of emphasis on the process here, and not necessarily the personal relationships among people. Am I appropriately interpreting you?
Well, maybe I haven't been clear because I've been talking about it in process terms, but I absolutely believe it's been about building personal relationships and trust.
That's great.
Absolutely. That is to the nth degree, and it just sounds so trite because people write books about that, but we've experienced it wholeheartedly here, and I can't say that strongly enough.
Talk a little more about that.
Well, I
understand the group of the core group that you put together and building trust with that larger group. Can you talk about sort of the trust among yourselves?
Among the coalition members?
Yeah.
Well, that was interesting too. It was probably a subset of that. We've got a wide variety of groups, and many groups have worked together here on various issues for years and years. And when we got together as a coalition, we bonded and unified strongly over a unified goal. But then when you get together and talk about how to get there, there were definitely times where people were going to be, dropping out, or I was going to quit. I mean, it was really hard because we had really hard fought. There were just times where the tactics of how we get from A to B. We had a lot of different approaches, and people felt pretty strongly about it. But we worked it out, and it was, like I said, it was just a subset of the larger community that internally I think we all became, we got to know each other and got to listen to each other and trust each other. And there were some times when a group might have lost to what they really wanted to do, but they still came along for the good of the whole. And, we've been together now for 12 and a half years. And the beginning few years where everybody was testing the water and trying to get to know each other, is Carolyn just a political operative that, those kind of things.
Right.
I mean, there's just that, it's again human nature. And we've built trust over the years, and there were definitely some bumps in the road.
You think time has a lot to do with trust building, then, the sort of repeated interaction over a number of subjects? Some of this had history before the 12 and a half years, right? And then the long time of your working together and people coming to believe you were well motivated? I mean, I'm talking about to you in the plural sense. People began to believe that everyone was in fact working for the same thing, or that they were well motivated, or they had some integrity.
I think within the coalition that was already was established.
Okay.
But I think it was just about, is somebody going to push their, not really agenda, but I don't know how to say it other than tactics. If I truly believe that we need to do A, B, and C to get there, and somebody says, no, we need to, go to the press, or we need to, write a letter and threaten to sue, or whatever it might be. I mean, those aren't necessarily real examples, but that we worked it out, and we might have done a combination of a couple of things, and it may not have been successful, and it may have been successful, and we just kept moving forward. I think in the larger community, the thing about this plan is, even though I talked about it not being urban like the city of Tucson, a lot of are working together outside of that, federal endangered species process of the stakeholder committee a lot of what we were doing with the development community was working on their developments, going through the process of comprehensive plan amendments and rezonings, because the biggest cause of habitat destruction and fragmentation in the Southwest is urban development. So we weren't dealing with timber plans, we were dealing with development. And so then we got down to the core of the issues of what Pima County Board of Supervisors and Planning and Zoning Commission, all that works on, which is looking at development plans. And, again, in the, last 30 years, it was a zero-sum game. Somebody was either against it or for it, but you didn't sit down with the developer and try to make it better. And try to protect the environmentally sensitive areas. So in that sense, I think that was a lot of where, and I know I moved back out to the bigger group, but that's a lot of where we were building trust by keeping our word when we said we would support something, or we would come and actually get our hands dirty and say, well, I'm not trying to limit the amount of houses, I just want to protect this riparian area. And we'd sit down and pencil it out with these guys, and they would get our support, and those kind of things. So there were all these side programs going on outside of that 85-member steering committee that was huge in building trust, because we were all kind of working on the same things in about 5 different areas outside of the technical area of the Endangered Species Act, but it's all related.
Okay. We're very interested in the question of narratives and turning points. Can you you've given me sort of a narrative here of a long-term process of trust building, with one turning point, of course, being the beginning, which was the suit on the pygmy owl. Were there other critical junctures, you think, that where victories were consolidated, or when challenges were presented that pushed things in a different direction, or accelerated or impeded them? You know what I mean.
Yeah. I don't know if I can point to a turning point over those 4 years or so when we met, probably 6 years since the process started, other than the narrative I had, kind of an evolution of people getting to trust each other in the process moving forward. And I mean, the only kind of mini turning point was what I talked about before, that we got so frustrated that we were going to be there for years if all we ever talked about was how many votes it took to get something passed, and who were winners and who were losers, and we're counting up our votes and things like that. That mini turning point was when we just had enough and we said, okay, you, me, you, and you, I know you guys want to work something out and not just be a roadblock, so let's go over in a room. And I think that's when a lot of things changed. And just a sidebar on that was, I will tell you for a fact, and if Maybeen were still alive, she would confirm this, the county sat there for 4 years just waiting for this group to implode. They put together 85 people, and we all, it was like, and this is a funny little analogy, but it was kind of like growing up in a Catholic school when the nuns were so oppressive that all the kids became like really close because we had a common enemy.
Yes.
That was probably a lot of examples like that, but that was mine. Anyway, we felt oppressed in this, and we were sure that they put us together to make us fail. So people wanted to just leave. They just wanted to stop, and I kept saying, and I think a few of us said, listen, the county's going to move forward with the Fish and Wildlife Service regardless of our involvement. Do you want them to write it, or should we write it? And of course, like I said before, no matter what any of us could have pushed through, like the coalition might have been able to do something, but it's bound to, if you don't have community ownership, it's bound to, just unravel later, and you lose everything you got. There is a couple of examples like that, but I don't need that. Many examples where we actually did that when we tried to push some things through. But anyway, that's what we slogged through, and the county just waited for us to fail. They were just ready to write it themselves, and I think Maveen was probably halfway through it. And I kept saying, no, Maveen, just you wait. We're going to come out with something. And then, it was June, 2003, where we had a report where we gave them all of our recommendations. But I think like that little turning point was where we all just said, it's time for us to form the subcommittee. I mean, enough's enough.
That's great. Okay. One thing I want to be sure that I understand is sort of something about you. I'm interested in motivations to stick with a process for a long period of time. And in fact, I guess this has become a kind of life work, particularly the environmental side of it. This isn't exactly a profession for you, although perhaps it has been. What is it that sort of motivates you, that causes you to invest your time in this kind of thing?
Well, I mean, obviously that's what I get paid for, but I think that having worked with Mo Udall when I was in my 20s, and then Molly McCassin later on, having watched, I come from the politics side of it, really, but it's certainly always being an environmentalist, but watching Mo Udall at work and be able to be as successful as he was in getting legislation, I get choked up, really just thinking about working for him for 6 years and how I was able to really watch that close up. So
I was a great Udall admirer, so I share that.
Yeah, I feel so lucky. So I think that's probably my biggest inspiration. But but just the environmental. I'm an environmentalist from the get-go. But as far as trying to watch people and learn from how things get done, I think that I was really honored to have been asked to run this group, and that was just coincidentally when Molly decided that she was going to not run for re-election and then run for mayor for a couple of years later. So that was exactly when our coalition, we were meeting and talking about this, and then they asked me to, if I would consider this. And I did. And, we didn't raise any money for a little while. This was really grassroots, really from the ground. And so, I've thought about this a lot as far as what keeps me going. It motivates me because this is really important work. This is the future of our planet, and it's really, really important to me and all the people I work with. I get a lot of inspiration from the commitment of these incredible people I work with, which is, we have a lot of people that kick in, and for my coalition, we have a small staff of 3 people, but we also have a dedicated portion of people's times from other groups that are committed to coalition work. So I've got a pretty large staff of people that aren't directly responsible to me. They're responsible to Defenders or Audubon or Sierra Club or whatever, but they work closely with me, and it's been a real collective experience that, of course, I get a lot of credit for, but they're the ones with a lot of knowledge and all this passion, and that keeps me going. But the getting successes, as small as they may be sometimes, it can't be, undervalued. And if you can't celebrate your successes, even if you have to keep moving on to something else, it's really easy to get discouraged. And sometimes I wonder how I've been able to do this so long, but a lot of it is that, and a lot of it, back to what you said before about personal relationships, a lot of that really, I think, keeps people going. I have some people that I think that trust me in this town that, not in our own group, but in the bigger community, that that's the way to get things done. And I don't know if I could ever quit as long as there are more issues to be worked on.
Good. You talk about always being an environmentalist, and sort of at core, that's what you care about, the future of the planet. Are there particular things in the Sonoran Desert that inspire you? And I'm particularly interested to hear. We've talked about the pygmy owl, but are there other things that you really wanted to save that you feel a strong commitment about?
I don't think that I would pick any particular species out of the Sonoran Desert. It's probably a little more vague to me because I wasn't raised here, but I moved here when I was 20. Not here, but up in Tempe. And having experienced the Sonoran Desert for the first time as an adult, I've just been overwhelmed by it. I mean, as a whole, I mean, the Sonoran Desert is something that has so much power to me that I just can't. It's just the most beautiful place in the world. So it wasn't even the pygmy owl, other than, the pygmy owl is obviously like a canary in the coal mine, just a lot of these other species that are in decline, and so we need to focus on those to help realize what we're losing and what we need to protect. But it's not about any of those individual species for me.
Okay. A lot of what we're looking at has to do with this western Sonoran Desert and the area around Ajo. Is there any part of what you've done that's particularly related to that?
Other than it being a part of the bigger picture, I mean, like I said to you in the email, we feel that the western Pima County has not needed our help as much because it's almost all federal land, and a little bit of state land and a little bit of private land, and of course there's the Oregon Pipe, Forest and Cactus National Monument and all that. But so again, what we have been focused on is this whole burgeoning urban development. And when I assume that when you're talking about western, you're talking about on the other side of the Tohono O'odham Nation, because there's Altar Valley and Avra Valley that we've worked a lot over there on the other side of the Tucson Mountains, but that's still, I think, considered eastern Pima County. But we've worked in many of these rural areas, but western Pima County, except on a couple of smaller kind of development plans and things like that, it hasn't seemed to require attention from us.
Okay. Can we turn a little bit to the future? And we've got what I would call, and please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing anything, a pretty positive narrative, and certainly a non-conflictual narrative. You admit there's conflict, and that's inevitable, but the main lines of the story are cooperative lines. How do you view that sort of going forward? And am I right that this is an optimistic and positive story?
Yes, I think it has been, although I think we have, in a bit probably selective memory, just like I've heard of, women having childbirth and forgetting about the pain. I haven't had any, but you hear about that. It was hard fought. I mean, it didn't come easy. Now, as I say, we're sitting back in our chairs talking about the process and talking about cooperative. That's what came out of it. Going forward, this is a long-term process, and one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, I mean, I think part of it that it's taken so long to formulate, we've got piece by piece over a dozen years, but the thing that concerns me in a sense is that after a few years the players change, and we've been lucky with the county staff, Fish and Wildlife Service, the coalition, and the board of elected officials, but in some of the interest groups like the home builders and realtors, there's like such a turnover that we get new people from out of town that just haven't, you kind of got to start all over again. And I hope that what we're trying to do now is to really contractualize this whole agreement, and that is just because it's a contract with the feds or some of these ordinances are in place, then that doesn't mean that you're done, but it is a constant kind of re-education, because we grew up together on this. I mean, none of us had ever done anything like this before. I mean, done anything like this particular multi-species habitat conservation plan. So county staff and the home builders and the realtors and the ranchers, I mean, we all kind of learned from kindergarten up together. So the one thing that's now becoming difficult is years down into it, we've got and we're still not done. We have new players that we want to make sure we don't just say you got to sign on because your predecessor did. You really want them to understand and be part of it too. And I wonder how we're going to be able to do that when the players start changing.
One of the things we haven't talked about is the role of science here. And I know some of the people that I've talked to were on scientific kind of advisory bodies. Do you think in this business of sort of re-educating, in this business of educating new people, that the base in biological science is a help? Or just talk to me a little bit about the role of science. I think I've got a good sense of the role of politics here.
Yes, well, I didn't go into that because it sounds like that you've talked to the science community, but from the public end, I think there has been, we kept in touch and went to a lot of meetings and tried to have input as much as was appropriate, but at a certain level, I mean, there was a lot of, we watched that process and realized that there's a variety of ways the scientists could have moved forward, take a left turn over here and come up with this instead of that, habitat map or this way of doing things. And we basically have signed on. And that was a big part of it, was that the community had a trust that these scientists were there doing real science and that we were going to, stamp our stamp of approval on that and then go from there. Of course, that's not the end. Then what do you do with it? But there's been an incredible, legitimacy and credibility to the team that Dr. Shaw had, and the county told him, just, go forth and don't worry about this, that, or the other. Just do what you think you need to do. Tell me what's important for the critters and habitat here, and that's what they put together. And then there were other scientific processes. I'm sure you've heard about the hundreds of reports that were done by experts and all this information. I mean, I think the call from the beginning of this process to the scientific community is that we want you to be scientists. I think Bill Shaw, I don't know if he admitted, but he's been around for a long time, and I think he's been like many of the scientists, involved in any public process. They've kind of been given their marching orders, like this is what we want to see, so that you're not allowed to do pure science. This is what you can get away with, and that's not what happened in this process. And it's been really wonderful to watch, and it's been wonderful to watch these guys that, no offense, but sit in the ivory tower all the time. And, then they're able to take what they know, and they're teaching generations of students, and they're able to come out here and apply it to the real world. And I've seen so much engagement from those guys because they see that they're making a difference. I think it's pretty neat.
Yeah, I do too. Is part of the trust that the community has in these scientists, and I take seriously your comment that scientists have discretion. They can take studies in one way or another, emphasize one thing. They're not neutral. Even good science is not neutral.
Right.
And yet the community trusts these people. Is that because they clearly are part of the community and are willing to spend this kind of time? What explains that?
That's a good question. I think that what you're saying, it has a lot to do with it. And people watched them meet for years, and they watched them struggle over things, and they saw them having an honest discussion. I mean, there were heated discussions about which way to go within that, the science teams that got together. So I think people realized, not everybody went to the meetings, but, they knew what was going on there and saw some of these debates, that these guys were having a real discussion. They were struggling with things too, and they did the best they can. So, and again, that these were people that were put in that room together were people that, did have some trust. I mean, the thing about it, though, is that a lot of the people in the regulated community, they didn't know any of these guys. I mean, a lot of us did because they're kind of famous, and Bill Shaw is famous, and, because of the work that they've done and some of the people that got involved in different species, in the environmental community. But these guys didn't know who they were. But they did, they had, credentials, and there was a pretty broad group from the different agencies, state, federal, university, NGO agencies that got together and provided their expertise. And I don't know exactly how to answer that from other.
Well, I think you already are answering it, because you're saying there's a diversity of different kinds of scientists, and and there was a lot of them, and they deliberated in the open.
Yep.
So those things clearly had something to do with the credibility, as well as their willingness to try to communicate with people and try to be part of the groups.
Yes.
Okay, well, Carolyn, you've been terrific. Have I left anything out that you want to say?
No, I don't think so. If I see your draft and it brings up some, blank spots that I should have talked about, if that's okay, I'll kick in there. But I'm really glad, and I hope I wasn't trying to not talk to you. I just didn't want to waste your time if there was, specifically about the Western Pima County. But this has been great. I've just loved to talk about my work. So
good.
It's been quite. I'm sorry Maylene isn't here to